Thank you and good morning. And I want to thank you, Bev, for all that you have done over the years, lifting up women. I've known you for a very long time, and you have taught me everything that I know. You've taught me about tenacity and speaking truth to power and standing up and representing the interest of women who unfortunately oftentimes are left out in the sunshine of opportunity. So thank you for all that you have done. And I want to thank all of the wonderful organizations who are here today. Thank you for forming and joining this important conversation to re-envision how we can end gender-based violence in New York. And I'm grateful to the groups that are represented here today for their work and their advocacy on this issue. PowHer New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault, the Center for Court Innovation, Just Beginnings Collaborative, Steps to End Family Violence, and Spring Up. And I want to thank all of you. Today's conversation is about exploring solutions to end gender-based violence that support survivor autonomy, healing, and accountability. Unfortunately, the issue of gender-based violence is far too prevalent. And 1 in 3 women experience some form of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And women of color are particularly impacted by gender-based violence. Over 40% of Black women have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner. Black women report experiencing violence at a rate 35% higher than reported by their white sisters. And about 30% of Latina women have experienced violence from an intimate partner. And 21 to 50% of Asian American Pacific Islander women have also reported experience intimate physical or sexual violence. We also know that gender-based violence is not just a woman's issue. It's an issue that impacts everyone. And gender-based violence is also experienced by men as well as by those who do not fit the gender binary, with the non-binary and trans community especially vulnerable. 1 in 4 men have experienced violence from an intimate partner, and almost half of all transgender people have experienced sexual assault in their lifetime. And too many transgender people, unfortunately, die as a result of sexual assault and sexual violence. This is an issue that cuts across race, gender, class, zip code, and has become especially problematic during COVID-19, as all of us have endured for a year social isolation and being locked inside the door of homes that unfortunately have become torture chambers for some women. Here in New York, we know that domestic violence became another epidemic during the pandemic. The stay-at-home orders led to a dramatic increase in domestic violence incidents across the state. Many organizations saw a surge in calls to their hotlines and visits to their website, especially as many people were cut off from access to in-person services. This conversation today is so important because we know there is a need to address gender-based violence and explore new solutions to achieve justice and accountability. Attitudes and responses towards gender-based violence have shifted dramatically in my lifetime, from being seen as a private and family matter, or just the way things are, to individuals who are told to mind their own business, to now being understood as a national, even a global issue that requires a holistic approach from education to counseling to privacy and to legislation, and that we are each other's brothers and sisters' keeper, and that we have to look out for one another, and that it's okay, and we give you license to be nosy and to report sexual and physical violence when you witness it or see it or suspected in your community, on your block, in your building. In 2019, the state legislature passed the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, which reduced sentencing for victims who commit crimes against their abusers in self-defense. The legislature also passed a bill expanding the definition of domestic violence to include forms of economic and financial abuse. And just this past January, the state announced a comprehensive package to combat domestic violence by proposing to allow courts to require abusers to pay for damage to their housing, moving expenses, and other housing costs. It reminds me of a case that where I represented a young woman when I was a public defender. It was one of my last cases as a public defender, a young woman who unfortunately was abused for a very, very long time and ultimately took matters in her own hands because her house was not her home and she was not safe. Ultimately, we were successful, but after that experience, she was so vulnerable, and it led me again to run for office and to address the issues of victims of domestic violence and ensure that victims now can become survivors and that pain can be transformed into purpose. You know, these continued efforts to protect the rights and resources of survivors are critical, including the work many of you have been doing to advocate for domestic violence survivors to be able to keep their election registration information confidential. And while New York State has taken important legislative actions, it is important that we explore other potential restorative justice and community accountability practices outside of the law and policy. The bottom line is we still have a lot of work to do in the state of New York and beyond. And there may be multiple ways to repair harm caused by gender-based violence and to hold perpetrators of violence accountable. The pandemic has been a reckoning and has made us rethink how we approach many societal issues, including gender inequality and racial inequality and housing issues and economic issues. And we must all recognize that, again, this is not a woman's issue, but a societal issue, and that all of us must be at the table, including survivors. We must harness this opportunity to reconsider the status quo and explore new approaches and solutions, including to address gender-based violence, and that we cannot return to the same old ways. We cannot return to normalcy. We've got to rethink and reimagine how we are going to return as we see the light at the end of the tunnel. I want to express my support and admiration to those who have spoken out as survivors of gender-based violence. I admire you and thank you for your strength, and I lift you up. It is not an easy thing to do. For those of you who have spoken out, and I and countless others, we stand with you. And for those of you who have not spoken out, I stand with you too. And I give you strength, and I give you my prayers. And I allow all of you to stand on our shoulders. There is no one right way for survivors to heal. There may be no one right way to seek justice. Every survivor has a different story, but your story must be told, and it must be heard by others so that others can no longer suffer in silence. And what is important is that we as allies, that we center survivors and prioritize their needs. My office will always be an ally in this work, from defending the rights of survivors against violence and abuse to working with organizations to ensure survivors can access the resources and supportive services they need, and attorneys that they need as well, and attorneys who will stand up for justice and who will fight for them, just as I did for that young girl when I was a public defender. We must continue to work together to end all forms of violence and push for a more just society where everyone, regardless of gender identity, is seen, valued, and treated with respect. And to end my story, I saw that young girl most recently. She's married now with children. and she's living a wonderful life. Again, I thank all of you for your work to support survivors and to end gender-based violence across New York State. This conversation is critically important, and I stand with you today and every day in support of survivors. And I hope that your story will be told and that your life, again, will begin and end in happiness. Thank you and have a blessed day.